Officers stopped him, suspicious of his behavior. They brushed off the badge and his wallet, mocked his silence, and joked that he was just another guy in a fancy coat acting self-important. But 5 minutes later, everything changed. The Royal Regiment arrived and suddenly, it was clear, this wasn't just any man on the street. They had just detained a Coldstream Guard. Before we reveal what happened next, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if you believe tradition still matters, make sure you're subscribed. Let's dive into the autumn twilight cast long shadows across the cobblestone street as Noah Redgrave maintained his vigil outside the Royal Ballet Academy. His stance was a masterpiece of military precision, spine straight as a rifle barrel, shoulders squared to attention, hands locked behind his back in perfect parade rest. To anyone familiar with ceremonial duties, this was the posture of a professional soldier. To the uninformed observer, it appeared almost unnaturally rigid. 37 minutes had passed since the ballet recital's scheduled conclusion, yet Noah remained as motionless as the bronze statues that adorned nearby Parliament Square. His breathing was measured, deliberate, each inhalation and exhalation controlled with the discipline that had been hammered into him during 12 years of service with the Coldstream Guards. The golden light spilling from the academy's windows illuminated his face, revealing the weathered features of a man who had seen both ceremony and combat. Emma, his 8-year-old niece, was somewhere inside that building, likely still glowing with post-performance excitement. The recital had been her biggest moment, yet a solo piece she'd practiced for months. Desperate to make her Uncle Noah proud, he'd given her his word that he would be waiting when she emerged, and a guardsman's word was his bond. The street hummed with the gentle activity of evening London. Parents clustered in small groups, some checking watches, others engaged in animated conversation about their children's performances. A few cast curious glances at the solitary figure, who stood apart from their casual gathering. His military bearing as obvious as a uniform. PC Rebecca Morgan had been patrolling this district for 5 years, long enough to develop instincts about what constituted normal behavior. The man standing outside the Ballet Academy didn't fit any normal pattern. Her radio had crackled with reports of a suspicious individual maintaining surveillance on the building, and now she could see why residents had called it in. That's definitely not right, she murmured to her partner, PC James Dawson, as they observed from across the street. Look at his posture. He's been standing exactly like that for over half an hour. People don't wait that way. The two officers approached with practiced caution, their footsteps echoing off the narrow street's walls. Morgan's training kicked in as she assessed the situation. Lone male, unusual behavior, proximity to a children's venue. Her hand moved instinctively to her radio, ready to call for backup if needed. "Excuse me, sir," Morgan announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "We've received multiple reports about suspicious activity in this area. I need to ask what you're doing here." Noah's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the crisp diction of someone who had spent years giving precise reports to superior officers. "I'm waiting for my niece, Constable. She's performing in the ballet recital." The answer should have been sufficient, but something about his absolute stillness troubled both officers. Dawson positioned himself at an angle, creating a tactical formation they'd rehearsed countless times during training exercises. "Sir, you've been standing in that exact position for quite some time," Morgan pressed. "That's not typical behavior for someone simply waiting. Are you certain that's all you're doing here?" Noah's eyes remained fixed on the academy's entrance, but his peripheral vision tracked both officers' movements. Years of standing post had taught him to remain aware of his surroundings, without appearing to do so. "I am certain, Constable. My niece Emma is 8 years old. She's been preparing for this recital for months, right? But why are you standing like you're on guard duty?" Dawson interjected. "Most people would sit on that bench over there. Maybe walk around a bit. You haven't moved a muscle." The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what Noah had been trained to do. For over a decade, he'd been conditioned to equate stillness with strength, discipline with dignity. The idea of casually lounging while on any form of duty, even waiting for a child, went against every instinct he'd developed. "This is simply how I stand," Noah replied, his tone remaining neutral despite the growing tension. By now, their conversation had attracted attention from the other waiting parents. Several had moved closer, drawn by the unusual sight of police questioning someone who appeared to be doing nothing more than waiting patiently. The murmur of concerned voices began to rise, and more than one phone was discreetly raised to record the encounter. Morgan felt the weight of the gathering crowd and knew she needed to resolve the situation quickly. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. Your behavior is causing concern among the local residents." Noah's movement, when it came, was as precisely controlled as everything else about him. His right hand moved to his jacket pocket, while his left remained firmly positioned behind his back. The motion was smooth, deliberate, and somehow more unnerving than his previous stillness had been. "Of course," he said, producing a leather wallet with military precision. "Here are my credentials." Morgan examined the identification under the streetlight. The military ID showed a younger version of the same face, but the bearing was identical, that same unwavering gaze, that same perfect posture. The civilian identification confirmed his name and address, but it was the military card that caught her attention. "Coldstream Guards," she read aloud. "Your active military, recently retired." Noah responded. 12 years of service concluded last month." Dawson's expression shifted slightly as he processed this information. "What did you do in the Guards?" "Ceremonial duties primarily. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, state functions. I also completed 2 operational tours in Afghanistan." The mention of combat service should have changed the dynamic entirely, but Morgan remained focused on what she perceived as abnormal behavior. "Look, I understand you're military, but standing like that for so long, it's making people nervous. Several residents have called this in." Noah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. After years of enduring tourists who treated him like a curiosity, who would wave objects in front of his face and make jokes about his immobility, he'd hoped civilian life would be different. Inside the academy, Emma Redgrave was taking her final bow to enthusiastic applause. The solo performance had gone perfectly, every turn precise, every leap graceful, every movement flowing like water. She'd been nervous all week, but knowing Uncle Noah would be waiting had given her the confidence she needed. As she curtsied to the audience, Emma caught sight of blue flashing lights through the studio windows. Her heart began to race, not from performance adrenaline, but from worry. Police lights meant trouble, and Uncle Noah had promised to be right outside. The situation on the street was indeed escalating. Morgan had radioed for backup, not because she felt threatened, but because the growing crowd was making her increasingly uncomfortable. Noah's absolute stillness, which had initially seemed suspicious, was now beginning to seem almost supernatural. "Look, mate," Dawson attempted, trying to inject some casualness into the conversation. "We appreciate your military service, we really do. But you've got to understand how this appears to civilians. You're standing there like you're guarding Fort Knox." "I'm waiting for my niece," Noah repeated, his voice never wavering from its calm, measured tone. "She's 8 years old. Her name is Emma. She's been learning ballet for 3 years. But why do you have to stand like that? Can't you just relax a bit? Maybe sit down. Lean against something?" The suggestion struck at the heart of Noah's training. For 12 years, he'd been taught that proper bearing was non-negotiable, that discipline was visible in every aspect of a soldier's posture. The idea of relaxing while on any form of duty was fundamentally foreign to him. "This is how I maintain my position," Noah said simply. The answer seemed to frustrate Morgan further. Nobody maintains a position like that unless they're hiding something, or they're not mentally stable. Which category do you fall into? The backup unit arrived as tensions reached their peak. PC Sarah Chen and PC Michael Roberts emerged from their patrol car to find a crowd of nearly 30 people watching the unfolding drama. The situation had clearly moved beyond a simple suspicious person inquiry. "Status report," Chen requested as she approached Morgan. "Potential surveillance of the building," Morgan replied tersely. "Subject has maintained the same position for over 40 minutes. Claims to be waiting for family member, but refuses to modify his behavior or provide reasonable explanation for his conduct." Chen studied Noah with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up in a military household. Her father had served with the Welsh Guards, and she recognized the signs immediately: the perfect posture, the controlled breathing, the way his eyes tracked movement without his head turning. This wasn't suspicious behavior. This was textbook military bearing. "Sir," she addressed Noah with obvious respect, "I can see you're former military. Which regiment?" "Coldstream Guards, Constable. 12 years ceremonial duties." "Palace Guard." Chen's tone carried new understanding. "Correct. My father served with the Welsh Guards. I'm familiar with the standards." This exchange clearly irritated Morgan, who felt her authority being undermined. "Sarah, the individual has been standing motionless for nearly an hour. That's not normal behavior regardless of his background actually, Rebecca. Chen replied carefully. It's exactly normal behavior for someone trained in ceremonial duties. Palace guards are conditioned to remain motionless for extended periods. It becomes automatic, as if to demonstrate her point. Noah continued to stand with perfect stillness throughout their entire discussion. The crowd watched with growing fascination, some beginning to realize they were witnessing something remarkable rather than suspicious. The deadlock might have continued indefinitely, but then a new sound began to permeate the evening air, the distinctive rhythm of military boots, striking pavement in perfect unison. At first, it was barely audible, like distant thunder. But, as the seconds passed, the sound grew clearer, more purposeful, more unmistakable. Every head turned toward the approaching sound, and what they saw made several onlookers gasp audibly. Marching down the street in flawless formation was a complete section of Coldstream Guards, their scarlet tunics and towering burskin caps creating an imposing silhouette. Against the twilight sky at the formation's head strode Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Hargrave, a woman whose very presence commanded immediate attention. She was tall and imposing, with silver hair pulled back in regulation style and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the scene before her. Her uniform was impeccable, her bearing absolutely perfect, and her expression suggested she was far from pleased with what she was witnessing. The guards executed a perfect halt exactly 10 feet from Noah's position. The synchronization was flawless, 20 pairs of boots stopping as one, creating a sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings like a single, decisive clap. Section. Halt, Hargrave commanded, though the order was purely ceremonial. Her men had already stopped with machine-like precision. Stand easy. The collective movement of the guards shifting to a relaxed position created another perfectly synchronized sound. They now stood at ease, but their presence was no less commanding. The message was clear. They had come for one of their own. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrave stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the assembled police officers before settling on Noah. Sergeant Redgrave, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for over 20 years. Ma'am. Noah responded, his voice steady, but carrying a note of relief that only someone who knew him well would detect. The arrival of a full military unit had completely transformed the situation's dynamic. What had moments before been a routine police investigation had suddenly become something of much greater significance. The crowd pressed closer, phones were raised, and the entire scene took on an air of historical importance. Hargrave turned her attention to the police officers, her expression neutral, but her eyes suggesting she was not impressed with what she had found. Officers, she said formally, is there some difficulty here? Morgan found herself in an uncomfortable position. She'd been trained to maintain control of situations, to assert police authority when circumstances demanded it. But the arrival of a lieutenant colonel leading a military formation had shifted the balance in ways her training hadn't prepared her for. We received reports of suspicious activity, she explained, trying to maintain her professional composure. The individual was observed maintaining surveillance positions for an extended period, displaying behavior patterns that concerned local residents. Hargrave's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she was evaluating this explanation and finding it wanting. Suspicious activity, she repeated, her voice completely flat. And what specifically did you find suspicious about Sergeant Redgrave's conduct? He's been standing in precisely the same position for over an hour, Morgan elaborated. No normal individual maintains that level of stillness unless they're concealing something or suffering from some form of mental disturbance. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Behind Hargrave, the guards remained motionless, but there was something in their collective bearing that suggested they were not pleased with what they were hearing. I see, Hargrave said slowly. And tell me, Constable, what is your understanding of Coldstream Guard's training protocols? Well, I know they guard the royal residences, Morgan stammered. Indeed. And do you have any comprehension of how they accomplish this duty? I assume they stand guard. They stand guard, Hargrave repeated, her tone making it clear this was a gross oversimplification. For 6-hour shifts, in all weather conditions, without movement, without conversation, without response to any form of provocation. Hargrave was building towards something, and everyone present could sense it. The crowd had grown silent, hanging on every word of this unexpected confrontation between military and civilian authority. Sergeant Redgrave, she continued, spent 12 years perfecting this discipline. He has maintained his post while torrential rain soaked through his uniform. while snow accumulated on his equipment, while summer temperatures reached dangerous levels. He once stood guard for 6 consecutive hours while a wasp had become trapped inside his burskin and repeatedly stung him. The story drew murmurs from the crowd, but Hargrave was far from finished. She was constructing a case, and every word was carefully chosen for maximum impact. During his service, Sergeant Redgrave was selected for operational deployment in Afghanistan. He served with distinction in some of the most dangerous regions of Helmand Province. He was awarded the Military Cross for valor after maintaining his position for 14 hours while under sustained enemy fire, never once abandoning his post or compromising his discipline. The weight of this information was beginning to register with everyone present. This was a man who had literally stood firm under enemy fire, who had been trained to remain motionless under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and he was being questioned for displaying exactly the discipline he'd been taught to maintain. But perhaps most relevant to tonight's circumstances, Hargrave continued, her voice gaining intensity, is that Sergeant Redgrave has spent countless hours standing guard while children played in his vicinity. During state ceremonies, royal weddings, and public celebrations, he has maintained his position while hundreds of children ran, played, and performed around him. The suggestion that he would pose any threat to children is not merely incorrect, it's deeply insulting. Morgan was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. The man she'd been treating as a potential threat was actually a decorated veteran, whose entire career had been built on the very discipline she'd found suspicious. I had no way of knowing, she said quietly. Precisely, Hargrave agreed. You had no way of knowing. But that's exactly the issue, isn't it? You made judgments based on your limited understanding of military discipline and bearing. As the confrontation reached its crescendo, the academy doors finally opened. A stream of young dancers emerged, their faces bright with excitement and accomplishment. Among them was Emma Redgrave, still wearing her pale pink performance outfit, her hair secured in a tight bun that was now slightly disheveled from the evening's exertions. Emma's eyes immediately located her uncle among the crowd. Despite everything that had transpired, the police, the guards, the gathered onlookers, Noah was exactly where he'd promised to be. He stood in the same position, with the same perfect bearing, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Uncle Noah, she called out, breaking into a run with the uninhibited joy that only children possess. For the first time in over an hour, Noah moved. He stepped forward and dropped to one knee, opening his arms to receive his niece in an embrace that was both tender and fierce. The crowd watched in complete silence as the decorated veteran held the little girl, who had unknowingly been at the center of this entire incident. You were magnificent, Noah whispered against Emma's ear. Absolutely magnificent. Did you see my solo? Emma asked, pulling back to examine his face. I remembered every single step. I saw every moment, Noah assured her, though of course, he had been outside throughout the entire performance. You were perfect. Emma surveyed the crowd with wide eyes, taking in the police officers, the formation of guards, and the dozens of onlookers with obvious curiosity. Why are all these people here? Did something happen? Nothing important, sweetheart, Noah said, gently. These are just some colleagues from my old unit who came to check on me. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrave approached, her stern expression softening as she addressed the child. You must be Emma, she said, her voice much warmer than it had been moments before. I'm Colonel Hargrave. I used to work with your uncle. Emma looked up at the imposing woman with fascination, rather than fear. Are you a soldier like Uncle? No, I am indeed, Hargrave confirmed. And your uncle is one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command. The crowd began to disperse as the evening's drama reached its natural conclusion. The guards formed up and marched away with the same precision they displayed upon arrival. Their mission accomplished, the police officers returned to their vehicles, though Morgan would spend the remainder of her shift contemplating the training seminar she'd been ordered to attend. Noah and Emma remained together in the soft glow of the streetlights. The little girl chattered enthusiastically about her performance, about the other dancers, about the music and the elaborate costumes. Noah listened with the same focused attention he'd once given to operational briefings, storing away every detail because this was what truly mattered now. Uncle Noah, Emma said as they walked toward his car. Why do you always stand so perfectly straight? The question had been asked in various forms throughout the evening, but coming from Emma, it carried no judgment or suspicion. It was simply the innocent curiosity of a child who wanted to understand her uncle better. It's called discipline, Noah explained as they walked. When I was a soldier, I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is hold your ground, no matter what happens around you. No matter who tries to make you move, you stay exactly where you need to be. Like when bullies at school tried to make me give them my lunch money. Emma asked. Noah smiled, a genuine expression of warmth, not the controlled demeanor he'd maintained all evening. Exactly like that. You stand your ground, and you don't let anyone push you around. And your friends came to help you stand your ground tonight. Something very much like that, Noah agreed. As they reached the car, Emma glanced back at the academy where her evening had begun so innocently. Uncle Noah, will you come watch my next performance too? Noah opened the passenger door for her, his movements still precise and controlled, but now warmed by genuine affection. I'll be there, he promised without hesitation. I'll always be there. As they drove through the London streets, Noah reflected on the evening's events. He'd been trained to stand guard against external threats, to protect what was valuable from those who would harm it. Tonight, he discovered that sometimes the most important thing you can guard is simply the right to be yourself, to maintain your dignity, to honor your training, and to be present for the people who matter most. The incident would indeed go viral within hours, generating hashtags, debates, and discussions about military service, police training, and the nature of discipline itself. But for Noah, none of that publicity mattered as much as the small hand that reached over to squeeze his own, and the quiet voice that said, "I'm really proud of you, Uncle Noah." Sometimes, that acknowledgement is all the validation a soldier needs.